He was born in 1849 in Massachusetts, which is the same year as the California Gold Rush. And he knew early on he wanted to be a plant breeder, to grow things. His dad wanted him to be a doctor. That didn't work. So Luther had a small farm back in Massachusetts. He had a couple of older brothers who'd been moved out here to California already, and they were writing home to Luther going, if you want to grow plants, don't do it in Massachusetts where the ground is full of rocks and it snows. Come out to California where the weather's better. So he came out and spent 50 years living here on this property. He also had some ranch space out in Sebastopol growing plants. He spent 50 years doing what he wanted, was plants. He introduced over 800 plants. He did a white blackberry. He did a spineless cactus. He did the Santa Rosa plum, which is still a really popular one. 800 different plants that he developed. He built this greenhouse. It was his design, and his dad had made bricks back in Massachusetts, so he used his dad's recipe for the bricks and the mortar. So when the 1906 earthquake happened, and Santa Rosa, 2 blocks down the street, collapsed, all of their brick buildings fell down. This one didn't have any damage to it whatsoever. Not a crack in the glass, nothing moved on the, and he said it was because he used his dad's recipe for the brick. So what we've got in here, it's still used as a greenhouse. Our volunteer gardeners were in here this morning. Our docent is our garden curator is getting her PhD at Davis right now, and so on Tuesdays and Thursdays she leaves directions. So it's fill a 6-pack with dirt from the barrel back here. Use a butter knife to put holes in it. Use 1 label per 6-pack. Pull the little seedlings out of here and put them in the 6-packs, and then put the 6-packs on the windowsill. So they'll go from the 6-packs either to a larger container or straight into the ground when they get a little bit bigger. So some of these will go out in the garden, some of them will go on our plant cart for sale. Volunteers, gardeners have been digging up. We've got 2 plant beds right out here. One of them is full of Shasta daisies, which was one of Luther's big projects. Another is cannas, which stand like 6 feet tall. And they're digging them up and separating them and putting some of them back in and potting the rest. So have as much material that Luther left as possible. The way he worked is he developed something new. He'd get a small pea that ripened at the same time that a canner was looking for, and then he'd sell all of it to somebody else. So it's hard to keep track of what he did, because once he sold it to a nursery company, they changed the names on them. Flowers in particular come and go in fashions. So if you've got a flower that lasts 10 years commercially, that's a big success. And since his last new developments were in 1926, there are a lot of his flowers. We know he worked on them because we've got lists, but we have no idea whether anybody has them. But there are a lot of things that are still around, as I say. He did the first plum cot. You cross a plum with an apricot, you get something new, and he was the first one who did that commercially. Now they have plum cots and pluots and apriums and apricots and other combinations, but he just liked to experiment. He could see how things might work, and he went for it. He'd plant thousands of flowers, and at the end of the season he'd save a dozen, and then they'd burn the rest of it. He burned like 99% of the stuff he ever did because it wasn't doing what he wanted. And he was very clear he wanted a bigger flower, he wanted something that bloomed earlier, he wanted a sweeter scent, and plants that didn't match what he wanted, he got rid of. Well, it is, but it's also a very clear way of moving forward, because he wanted the Shasta daisy, he wanted a big flower with very white petals. So if you got a flower that had, it was a big flower, but the petals weren't bright enough, he didn't want that. Or he had a flower with very bright petals, but it was too small, it didn't match what he was looking for. So he kept getting the biggest, brightest, and it took him 17 years. He worked on that one for a long time to get just exactly the flower he wanted. And he got it. It was a big flower with very white petals, with yellow centers. It makes a good cut flower in the house or a good garden flower. He did not work on the scent. That was not one of the things on his list because Shasta daisies stink. But other than that, he got everything he was looking for there. The seeds in here, because when he was ready seeds, they could sell them. There were no patent laws about plants at that time. So he used the safe for things that were ready to go out to nursery companies. So it's got his name on it and all. This is the kind of records he took. He'd take a pear, cut it in half, stick it down on the page. So that's pear juice there. Trace around it, write a few notes for himself. The more hash marks it has, the happier he is with it. So he was very happy with this particular pear. Yeah. Here, not quite so happy, but the hash marks are bigger, so it probably meant something to him. He kept everything in his head. He worked a lot just by intuition. He'd go out and he'd be inspecting a row of plants and he'd be tying strings around the ones that he really liked. When we ran out of string, he'd tear strips off of his shirt and tie that on so that he'd mark the ones that he thought were going to do what he wanted them to do. Luther Burbank's little dog Juanita had passed away. It's like in the last year or so there was the giraffe cam waiting for the baby giraffe to be born, and Fiona the baby hippo, and in 19... Working on. He wanted very white petals, he wanted a very bright yellow center, a good long, strong, straight stem, and they're sturdy, they're still growing in March. So
what's that called again?
It's Shasta Daisy. Shasta Daisy because it was as white as Mount Shasta. Oh. Yeah, there were 4 different daisies that went into the parents of this. It started with a tiny little field daisy from Massachusetts that he remembered from his boyhood. One from England, one of the ones that he would have kept because it's got everything he wanted. Really white petals, the yellow center, long stem, and any scent to it at all. Some of them are. And he said, sure, I bet I could do that. And so every place where there's a little, you can see really well here, every place there's a spot on here, there should be a really long spine coming out. And this one has little tiny ones. We've got about 7 different varieties in here. So these got little tiny spines. Some of them have, as I say, it's almost like fuzz, but it hurts. And so it did work exactly that. We spent 7 or 8 years working on this. The fruit is edible. We make jam from it occasionally. And he said, sure, I bet I could do that. And so every place where there's a little, you can see really well here, every place there's a spot on here, there should be a really long spine coming out. And this one has little tiny ones. We've got about 7 different varieties in here. So these got little tiny spines. Some of them have, as I say, it's almost like fuzz, but it hurts. And so it did work exactly that. We spent 7 or 8 years working on this. The fruit is edible. We make jam from it occasionally. Yeah, did manage to make it the spineless cat. With fruit and fruit trees was called grafting. If you take a stick of one plant and attach it to a existing tree, you can get fruit in 2 to 3 years rather than 5 to 6 years. Called grafting. And so every place there's a silver tag on this tree is a different apple, or in some cases pear. We've got 2 pears, and I think it's fruits. This one, well, you can see one of them is already leafing out with buds on it, and the rest of them are still. Yeah, so we have a plum cot, and the tiny little thing on the outer end is an apricot. Apricots don't like growing in Sonoma County, so that's like the 3rd one that's been in there. In the spring, when Luther got his first sample from a missionary who was traveling in Korea and China, and found this and sent it to Luther, thought this would be interesting. She also took it home to New Zealand. Luther called it a hairy plum, also a climbing plum, and nobody was really interested in eating something called it. He actually didn't have very many trees on the property when Luther was working here because he was growing a lot of vegetables. He wanted open space, no shade to deal with. But it looks funny because in 1938, the top of the carriage house burned part of the tree, and they started to cut it down, and then they realized, oh, it's still alive. So if you look at it from the right angle, cut it up there, and then realized there was still green wood in there. It was still a live tree. Of this one, what they did was they took one of the branches from the parent tree, which was drooping down, and they undergrounded it. They buried. Yeah, it's going to be hard to film it in here probably because the lighting is not good in any of the rooms. Before moved into it with his mom and his sister, and lived here until 1906, where he built a bigger house across what then was a street that went out. That house, unfortunately, has not survived. When Luther died in 1926, his widow Elizabeth remodeled this house and moved back into it. She never lived here with Luther. It had been used as an office and storage for about 20 years before she came back in. So the kitchen here was remodeled in the mid-1920s, which is why it has this is one of the first refrigerators. It is a refrigerator. It's electric. It's not an ice box. And tiny little space inside this space here is all the freezer there is. So you can't get much in the way of ice cream in there or a frozen pizza. But it was better than an ice box, because if it were an ice box, the ice melts. And it is necessary because if it spilled all over the floor, your parents would not be happy. We suspect at one point that there was it's a little crawl space back under there. We suspect possibly when this was a wood stove, you might be able to keep kindling under there. Or, as I say, the house was remodeled 2 or 3 times, because you can tell odd space after they did some remodeling. They couldn't figure out how to do baked goods. You've got the screening on here so you can keep the bugs out, a little air going through. Down here you put your flour and things, and it's a good height to roll out pie crusts. Yeah, it's a nice piece. It's the style is from the Midwest, which makes sense because Elizabeth grew up in Michigan. So she either had it sent out or she described it to a local woodworker and somebody built it for her. Because we've had a number of people with Santa Rosa roots here. It's called D-I-L-L-Y. Yeah. Drawn from one of Luther's catalogs. While the artist was working on drawing these, the publishing company figured out how to do color photography in books. So these never appeared in any of them. This is a phenomenal berry. It's about 3 inches long, and various varieties of plums and plum cups. Let's see. Plants, the way that Henry Ford was experimenting with automobiles and Thomas Edison was experimenting with electricity and everything else Thomas Edison had his hands in. And they saw him as the same sort of inventor, entrepreneur that he was. Apparently they acted like schoolboys and ran around playing jokes on each other in the garden for a couple of hours. Yeah, we've got money to build this craftsman style house, and it was across the street here, and this is where he lived with his wife Elizabeth, house to the city, and that's when the museum started out.
1977.
Yes. She was, when they got married, he was 68 and she was 27.
Wow.
So yes, it was by all accounts a very happy marriage. But yes. One was president, and Luther's wife passed away when Jimmy Carter was in office. In that one family. If you look around the ceiling, we've got the tile work. It's the story of Don Quixote. You can see him jousting with the windmills over the piano. This is one of the things that Elizabeth collected, was the tile work and the stained glass and that sort of thing. It was part of what she contributed to the house. The photos over the piano are their wedding photos. The only time she looks like a movie star in this one. Our favorite photo we have of her, she looks like what she was, which was a Midwest farm. We've got photos here of Luther at different ages, just after he came out to California in the 1890s when he was just getting famous, and then one of the last portraits of him at 77. Yeah, and to Burbank and Burbankian were words in the dictionary at one time. To Burbank was to invent, particularly with plants.
Dictionary.
Yes.
No.
Cells after the school they had there. So, but the except house belonged to a Burbank, belonged to Luther or Elizabeth, because a lot of historic houses you get the house with nothing in it. So the books were Luther's, and the furniture and all of the photos and that sort of.
And how many rooms is upstairs?
There's 3 bedrooms and a bathroom upstairs and a hallway. Yeah.
A house
Yeah.
back then.
Yeah, and then probably the front bed, because she expanded the dining room, and so probably.
It's the flowers from back there.
Hmm?
It's the flowers from.
Yeah, those are the Shasta daisies that are out on the.
These are real ones or
No,
plastic?
these are plastic. Yeah, we can't have real flowers on the wall here of what the property looked like at different. Now here's where it was all over cactus. He was working with cactus. Property was cactus. And you can see how open and flat it was. He had about twice. He had 4 acres. We've got 1.6 left. So this would be standing on the porch of the new house, looking out across the property. And there are no trees because added windows in the house. The chimney at that point was in the middle of the house, and right now they're on either outside walls. So she did a lot of remodeling before she came back in here. Cedar of Lebanon is a big deal. It was a tree that somebody brought from Lebanon for Luther, so he had it in his front yard. We got lots of photos of important people with Luther in front of the Cedar of Lebanon. And when he passed away, he did not want to be buried up at the rural cemetery. He didn't want any monuments. He wanted to be buried under his cedar tree. We had to take it down. But Luther is buried out there, and then the ashes of his wife, their little dog, and 3 friends are out there with him as well. But yeah, so the cedar was a special. It was a Christmas tree, as it looks a lot like what my grandparents put in their house when they built it. Downstairs in the 3 rooms and the bath upstairs. So it's not
a very big house for something back then, though.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
nicely put together.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's a very livable house.
Thank you.
So did he ever live here, though? Or
Luther lived in this house from 1884 until 1906.
Then he
Yes.
built a new house.
Then he built a new house. He lived here with his mother and his sister. And then his sister got married. He and his mother moved into the big house, and she passed away in 1909. And he married Elizabeth in 1916, and they lived in the big house together. Was it even on there? I thought Reese's Peanut Butter Cups from 1917. They feel so modern, and then they have catalogs so that he could tell people, "I've got this new plum, I've got this new berry. Wouldn't you like to buy it?" What he was developing was to sell, and so he was making colored catalogs to show off the pieces that he was working on. No, there's nothing in there.
And this is a storage?
Yeah, that's just that's a closet. There's another one on the end here.
Okay.
Yeah. Coffee pot on the stove.
So
and,
you
yeah.
get your beans
Yep.
back.
Yep.
You get your beans.
Yeah. You get your beans all ground up.
You have to grind it.
Oh, not very long. A little longer than if you're using an electric one.
And
But
then
not
your
too bad.
coffee falls off
Yeah.
the pan.
Yep. Falls down through the middle. Go ahead and try turning it. It's a little stiff.
No,
Yep.
it goes out from
Yes.
there.
Yeah. There you go. Next.
And there was the coffee. And then the coffee.
Okay. Next turn.
Over the table.
Keep your fingers out of the way. Yep, that's it. That'd probably. Oh wow, you got it going real good.
You can work at
Yep.
Starbucks now.
Yep. Hand ground coffee. Somebody will tell you. Children. Elizabeth had a niece that lived with them for a while,
Oh, okay.
but Luther never had any children. He was actually married twice. He had a short marriage in the 1890s that ended. Gift shop workshops in here today. people were pricing things and labeling things, and we've got boxes and tables all over the place, but most
Don't
everything,
touch anything.
yeah, most everything in here is designed for us. The t-shirts are exclusive to us and that sort of thing, so.
Yeah, I'll do it because I don't want you. No, I don't want you to get everything like this.
Yeah, so we've got prints of the paintings from the kitchen, Gordon Hobby Firestone were here, and all of the Edison Pride of Place in the middle. And Bill Doyle, who founded Exchange Bank. Mr. Ryan, who had who never made, he gave to Luther. And then they went back to Henry Ford after Luther passed away. That's part of the Greenfield garage at one point. He also biked it, and no, they didn't have cows or anything. He was.
Go.
We are at Luther Burbank Home and Gardens. Number 2. Our next stop is Luther Burbank Home and Gardens. Number 3. Our last stop is Luther Burbank Home and Gardens.
Go.
We are at Luther Burbank Home and Gardens. Number 2. Our next stop is Luther Burbank Home and Gardens. 3. What did I say for number 2?
I just read through 2 and 3. Go.
Our next stop is Luther Burbank Home and Gardens. Number 3. Our last stop is Luther Burbank Home and Gardens.
I do.